Pleiadian Perspectives on Human Evolution by Amora Kuan Yin. Part 7, Chapter 4, Colonization of Earth. Ra's story continues. When the cocoons arrived in Earth's oceans, Earth was already inhabited by 25,000 humans. These humans had been on Earth for about 21,000 years. Prior to that time, a planetary ice age had rendered Earth barren. Those Earth beings were of the type who evolved from first and second dimensional states into their souled beings in human bodies. They were at the stage in their evolution that you have been taught to call cavemen, and they operated exclusively at first by means of animal instincts. Their consciousnesses had passed through those of several different kinds of animals on their way to becoming human. That particular stage of experience is something akin to finding yourself inside the body of a leopard or a deer or an eagle, for example, and experiencing life from the animal's perspective. This phase lasts a relatively short time, perhaps only hours or days at most, and then the spirit that is soon to be human may pass through another animal's or bird's consciousness prior to preparation for human birth. During that time, the soul receives experiences of instinctual nature, single-pointed focus, and whatever specific traits with which the animals are imbued. As a result, the young souls are better prepared for survival in the physical world. These animals who have briefly lent their experience to the evolving human souls are sometimes referred to as totems or allies. Once they evolved into humans, these young soul beings were incapable of language or rational thought for many centuries. They grunted and squealed like animals and lived only to survive and procreate. Like any mobile creatures, however, these new souls did have an ability to learn from experience. For example, if pain was experienced from touching a thorn a few times, they would begin to associate pain with the thorn and avoid touching it. Though this may seem highly insignificant, this stage of evolution of consciousness is respected just as much as any other. They are all crucial. At the time of the arrival of the cocooned beings and fragmented souls from Maldek, Earth's 25,000 inhabitants lived in many colonies all around the globe. They had created very simple languages that were a combination of hand gestures and single syllables mostly. Simple tools for pounding, scraping, cutting, and spearing had been invented in all of the groups. Raw foods were still their main sustenance, although they had learned to build fires and usually cooked meat, fish, and certain root vegetables. Originally, there were colonies with as few as 25 humans and up to as many as 2,500 in regions throughout 3 main continents: Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The North American colonies were in the area that is now called Mexico, Texas, and Central America, but extended further to the west. Most of the rest of the United States was underwater, and parts of Canada and Alaska were on separate continents. A few of the groups migrated into South America and Eastern Europe as well. These continents, however, did not exist in their present forms. Territorial feuding and battles were common, and there was even some cannibalism between unfriendly tribes, though not within individual groups. Dinosaurs still roamed the Earth, but were disappearing quickly. Most of the animal species common to this planet today were living on Earth at that time, though they have changed to varying degrees as necessary for adaptation to planetary and climatic changes. In the etheric and higher dimensional realms, life was simpler then as well. Davic kingdoms were well developed to manage the natural environment, caretake smaller regions and vortices, and maintain the poles, climate, and atmosphere. There were light beings at the core of Earth and at both poles who held orbital patterns, worked with sacred geometry and grid structures, and also maintained the pole positions. In addition, this latter group had the function of receiving and transmitting solar encodings and evolutionary stimuli, similar to those who had been at the core of Maldek. The Supreme Being, whom we might call the Solar Logos, actually held the light for the entire galaxy and was not local to Earth or your solar ring. The Pleiadian emissaries of light were responsible for monitoring the evolution of all species in the plant, mineral, animal, and Homo sapien kingdoms, and overseeing the Davic kingdoms. Their roles would increase as the spiritual needs of the existing humans progressed. The Syrians protected Earth from invasion physically and psychically, and were overseers of the release of evolutionary encodings at the correct times. The arrival of the cocoons took place around 147,500 years ago, though it is difficult to precisely pinpoint in time. Earth's orbital cycles around the sun were slower then. The day and night, the moon, and yearly time cycles were all longer. Therefore, correspondence to current timing is elusive. This may help account for some of the confusion about historical time sequences. When a planet moves at a slower pace, lifespans are altered, thinking processes are slower, seasons are more numerous and varied, and evolution is more gradual. The lengthier orbital time cycles were associated with the recent Ice Age, which was as a result of changes in the Sun's orbital patterns around the galactic center. If yearly orbits around the Sun had been the same length then as they are currently, the end of Maldek and arrival of the cocooned beings on Earth would have been exactly 156,000 years ago, meaning 6 precessional equinox cycles of 26,000 years. There are points in the galactic orbital pattern during which Earth always experiences a lengthy ice age, and this cycle had just passed. Earth's orbit slows down and widens during those times due to the Sun's orbital pattern, reaching a wider angle around the galactic center. It always takes just over 100,000 years for the slower cycle to be completed and the warming trend to take hold. Even after that point, the speeding up of Earth's orbit around the Sun is a gradual process, culminating in a major pole shift when a specific geometric angle is reached in the Sun's orientation to the galactic center. When that occurs, your Sun's orbital pattern around Alcyone, the central sun of the Pleiades, stabilizes to the 26,000-year time frame that Earth and your solar ring are now in. This stabilization occurred 130,000 years ago. These 26,000-year evolutionary and orbital cycles repeat over and over again for the entire time it takes the Sun to complete a full orbit around the galactic center, or approximately 230 million years. At the end of that time, the 100,000-year ice age and slower orbits occur as the relationship of the Sun to the galactic center changes relative to the Milky Way's orbital pattern around what we shall call the great central sun of all galaxies and of all that is. The orbits of the entire Milky Way around the great central sun, just like the orbits of your solar ring around Milky Way's galactic center, take the form of continual circles spiraling, connected with diagonal arms at the end of one circle and beginning of another. At the completion point of the circular orbit around the great central sun of all that is, the Milky Way galaxy enters a diagonal connecting link to the next ring on the spiral, which is an initiatic step into a new evolutionary cycle as well. That is what is occurring now on your planet. You, the people of Earth, are not only at the end of a 26,000-year Earth-Sun Pleiadian cycle. The entire Pleiadian system, which includes your solar ring, is at the end of a 230 million year orbit around the galactic center, and the entire Milky Way is at the completion of an infinitely longer orbit around the great central sun of all that is. All three of these cycles are synchronistically and simultaneously completing the last step of the spiral dance within a dance within a dance, making this a very crucial transition time. The objective is to finish without anyone's toes getting stepped on, so the next, more sophisticated and gracious dance may begin. What this adds up to in terms of planetary evolution is this. When the 100,000-year ice age ended, the Milky Way had nearly completed its move across the diagonal arm that connects the previous spiral ring to the new spiral ring on the greater cosmic spiral. This new ring, which all of us dwelling in the Milky Way entered fully at the beginning of 2013, begins a new and different evolutionary cycle in relationship to the God-Goddess all that is. Rebirth and initiatic spiritual leaps are beginning and will continue to be experienced. The previous galactic cycle, which is now ending, is called the evolutionary spiral of self-discovery and exploration. The new galactic cycle we are entering is called the evolutionary spiral of self-mastery and completion. The consciousnesses birthed during these transitional times are the products of new paradigms and new potentials, and benefit from all of the learning from the previous spiral, even if it is unconscious. It is like taking all of the dance steps learned in the previous lesson, mastering them, and then adding new steps that are much more exciting and challenging. The time on Earth for exploration of all possibilities is coming to an end. Those of you living on Earth at this time have had billions of years to experience all of the potentials of consciousness, both the light and the dark. You have been a victim and a victimizer. You have loved, hated, protected, feared, known prejudice from all sides. You have been a peacemaker, and in general, you have learned all of the options for human existence. You have been incarnate in bodies and discarnate in your souls 1,000,000 times over. You have been guides to others, and you have been guided. Most of you have been enlightened and or ascended, and then chosen to fall from grace. Hopefully, by now you have learned to suspend judgment on yourself and all others, and to have compassion and understanding, for you have had opportunities to experience everything possible. Those things that you have not experienced directly, you have chosen not to because you learned vicariously through the experience of others. But you have had the time and opportunity to know all parts of human existence. Now the time is at hand during which you must take an internal inventory. Who have you become? To what has all of this vast experience and exploration brought you? Who are you qualitatively beyond what you have done? The time is here now for choosing spiritual mastery and responsibility for creating and co-creating reality. Those who do not make this choice will be peacefully and non-judgmentally removed from this galaxy and taken to another galaxy that is just entering the phase you are just leaving, the evolutionary spiral of self-discovery and exploration. There they will begin anew the process of exploring light and dark, learning and forgetting, and so on. And once again, when that galaxy ends its long cycle and approaches the new evolutionary spiral of self-mastery and completion, these beings will be offered another opportunity to move up a spiral ring. Maldekians begin life on Earth. Let us continue with the story of what happened on Earth when the Maldekians, including the former Martians and Venusians, arrived. As mentioned previously, Earth was in the completion stages of a long ice age, and just yawning and stretching after a long winter's sleep. Those who lived on Earth at that time were of a minimally evolved consciousness, and they focused on survival only. So when the new ones arrived, it was decided by the planetary and galactic guardians that they should be placed in regions of the planet that were not yet inhabited. Because of their previous damage from the explosion of Maldek, it was also decided that they needed to be birthed as infants into human families instead of coming into life through the downstepping process from the fourth dimension and above. This would facilitate deeper healing of past life traumas during early infancy and toddlerhood. It was further determined that the beings from Maldek needed to have their memories of Maldek temporarily erased. Pleiadians who had evolved beyond third-dimensional consciousness were asked to volunteer to take on human forms on Earth and give birth to the Maldekians. Just over 2,000 Pleiadian couples agreed to do so. With completion of this stage of planning, the Maldekians were ready for preparation to be reborn. The cocooned beings who had been attended to by the dolphins were ready to emerge into the form of balls of consciousness and light from the cocoons. Their memories of the traumas of Maldek were removed first. Then these beings were treated with great care and respect as they were introduced to the animal species of Earth and taken through short-term blendings with the consciousnesses of specific animals. All of them, without exception, were blended first with the dolphins. They experienced the freedom and pure ecstasy and love of those beloved creatures. This experience imprinted their psyches with their own spiritual potentials and restored their sense of purity and innocence. This was their initiation in water. Next, they were introduced to and blended with various bird species. Their initiation and adaptability by air and visual acuity was accomplished at this stage. Then these new earthlings blended with flowers and trees and shrubs and received a higher level of stabilization and purification through the root systems. Blending with warm-blooded animals for a brief experience of the uses of animal instincts came next. These last two experiences with plants and warm-blooded animals were initiations into mammalian dry land adaptability and and the element of the earth. The final initiatory preparation took place when these ensouled beings were taken to the sun for a blending and mutual encoding. The solar and galactic evolutionary plan was encoded into their souls, and their individual divine plans for growth and evolution were encoded in the sun. The sun would carry the encodings for these beings, as it does for all life on Earth, as long as they lived. With this last initiation by fire and light, the beings entered into a deep sleep state, during which they were assisted in dreaming their own births and lives. By then, the 4,000-plus Pleiadian volunteers had long completed the downstepping process into the third-dimensional bodies, and had established their villages and colonies near what are known today as Bali, India, Samoa, and Hawaii. The size and placement of land masses were different than today, especially in Samoa and Hawaii. In both those locations, what are now small islands were parts of 2 continents that no longer exist. In fact, there were 12 continents on Earth at that time instead of 7. Those who were born into the first Balinese families were from the Maldekian colony called Sogan. The Mars II colonists became the first children of India. The first Samoan newborns had formerly inhabited Solaris on Maldek. The Hawaiian babies were those who had been in the Free Orion colonies. Approximately 2,000 years into the cycle of what is now the 26,000-year precessional cycle, babies began to be birthed to the Pleiadian Earth couples. These young ones were well nurtured, well nourished, and loved by their parents. They were told mythological stories that captured the karmic and spiritual themes from their forgotten past, as well as new stories with morals pertinent to their next stages of evolution and spiritual awakening. They were, without exception, peaceful and loving groups of people, with deep family and group loyalties and individualism in balance. The Pleiadian volunteers remained part of those cultures for nearly another 2,000 years, at which time they began to die out and not be reborn. It was time for the Maldekian Earthlings to be on their own again. Of course, the genetics they had inherited from their Pleiadian Earth parents were permanently a part of their human DNA, as they are still. The timing of their departure was partially determined by an influx of new souls coming to Earth from another galaxy that had been taken over by dark forces. Over 40,000 of these displaced seekers of peace and light arrived on Earth in the 4th dimension around 142,000 years ago. The Elohim assigned these beings to Earth because of the nature of your planet's function as a universal melting pot for damaged, displaced, and evolving souls and spirits. The Universal Federation of Galaxies had planned long before that Earth would be used as an experimental planet in the development of unity within diversity. Certain parts of various countries today are a microcosm on your planet of this function, just as the entire planet is a microcosm of the whole universe. To bring groups of beings from all over the galaxies and other solar rings within the Milky Way to Earth, and to find a way to facilitate individual and group enlightenment within and between diverse groups and spiritual paths was and is the goal. Therefore, as groups of beings such as these 40,000 needed a new home, Earth was it. Fairies arrive. By this time, the 4 colonies of former Maldekians numbered around 12,000 people, and the younger souls that were here before the arrival of the Maldekians numbered around 30,000. So the addition of 40,000 new Earthlings was quite significant. These latest arrivals were what you now know as fairies. They had lived as physical inhabitants of a planet about twice the size of Earth in their home galaxy. They had been about 1/3 of the population of the planet on which they lived, along with physical beings similar to humans. So the fairies were accustomed to living among larger races. Their role had always been that of peacekeepers and merrymakers. They teased and kept people happy and laughing at themselves, and helped protect and preserve the magical child aspect of human consciousness. They had taught the humans to sing, to dance, and to make harp-like instruments. Therefore, it was natural for them to take on the same roles on Earth. The fairies were kept in the 4th dimension for over 5,000 years when they first arrived on Earth. There they learned about plants and animals and varying races of the human beings. Their role as guardians of flowering plants was also a given, since their diets consisted of, and fibers for the clothing were made from, flowers. The fairies enjoyed the companionship of many Devic beings, angels, and personal guides who were also 4th dimensional. Human dream time was a favorite time for the fairies as well, for they could interact with the humans in their astral bodies. The humans with whom they interacted were greatly impacted by these rendezvous and began to create stories and legends about the little people. Songs and simple music were slowly introduced into the cultures of the various human tribes and colonies, including those young souls who were just evolving from 1st and 2nd dimensional consciousnesses. After those 5,000 years in the 4th dimension, the fairies began to downstep into 3rd dimensional bodies. At first, they came into the uninhabited regions of the continent that existed in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. After acclimating to 3rd dimensional Earth, the fairies migrated to the regions in which humans lived, introducing themselves only to young children in the beginning, as they do now. The love, acceptance, and delight of the children were so great that the children told their parents, and soon the fairies lived among the big people as well. As the fairies taught the humans more sophisticated songs to sing and instruments to make, they became more and more endeared to the people. Festivals were held to celebrate and share music among villages and colonies, and soon the entire continent was filled with nearly 20,000 fairies. The fairies taught the people light-hearted, competitive games to play at these gatherings. These games were very much like today's sack races, bobbing for apples, blind man's bluff, and relay games. As a result, the humans learned to take themselves and competition less seriously and to laugh at themselves more freely. Fairies meet the Mer people. Fairies gradually infiltrated and broadened the cultures in Bali, Samoa, and India, as well as North and South America, Asia, Africa, and what later became known as Lemuria and Atlantis. In Mu, the fairies discovered the existence of Mer people. Around 4,000 of the fairies moved into the coastal areas around what is now called Lemuria, and began to interact regularly with the dolphins, whales, and mer people, all of which existed in large populations in that area. The mer people were being prepared to be the first true Lemurians and the heart of the Lemurian culture. They were ecstatic, tantric beings whose senses of personal freedom, self-worth, and unconditional love were highly developed. Mer people were also quite spontaneous, childlike, and totally innocent, much like the dolphins and fairies. Their main distinguishing trait was a deep dedication to their roles as guardians of all life forms. These Mare people were adept at astral travel and interdimensional communications as well, and as part of that function, they too interacted with humans during dream time. They took the human spirits in their astral bodies and introduced them to the seas and many life forms there. They swam through the cosmos, hand in hand with humans' astral bodies, and helped them understand their relationship to various stars and star systems. As the Mer people guided these humans back toward Earth and their bodies, they would show the humans the lines of energy and light shining from specific stars to designated spots on Earth. Subconsciously, the humans received much awareness and preparation for future spiritual awakening, enlightenment, and reunion with the higher collective consciousness. The fairies and Mare people mutually delighted in one another's company. Their land and sea experiences were shared freely and generously, and all involved were greatly expanded by these sharings. As humans began to migrate onto the Lemurian continent, the Mare people remained hidden for a time, while secretly observing them and communicating with the fairies about human activities, attitudes, and lifestyles. Again, the small children were the first to be introduced to the Mare people, and with these initial contacts, the human children were strangely altered. Their parents began to notice subtle changes in the children's eyes and speaking voices. Their eyes became very watery, yet more focused at the same time. The children were opening their third eyes and seeing auric fields of color around people and plants. Their voices acquired a slight echoing resonance that came from deep inside their chests, and the very sound of their voices was enough to stir the hearts of the adults and older children. You see, upon physical contact with the Mer people, the souls and the Ka bodies of the young ones were activated and anchored into their physical forms. As a result, the universal stream of unconditional love began to flow through them spontaneously and freely. Even those who had not directly contacted the Mer people opened their hearts and eyes more just by being around the children who had. When the adults asked the children what had happened to them, the children innocently replied, "The sea people gave us new stars inside." These children's interpretation was at first believed to be fantasy, but as a few of the adults later experienced fleeting visions of light in their own third eyes and feelings of light opening in their heart chakras, they began to slowly realize that the stories from the children were perhaps more than fantasy. After a few months of contact, the children were told which specific adults they could bring with them to meet the Mare people. The dozen adults who were chosen had already started experiencing heart and third eye awakening, and with their first meeting and swim with the Mare people, they were spiritually cracked open. They swam and sat at the edge of the waters and sobbed as the depth of unconditional love moved through their dormant chakras and consciousnesses. Soon, another 12 adults, and then another 12, were brought to meet the Mare people until, after a few weeks, the entire population of the southern coastal area was interacting with the Mare people and the fairies. It was a delightful and joyous time for all, and the people were extremely grateful to and respectful of their Lemurian friends. Gradually, more and more people migrated onto the continent of Lemuria, with colonies located in each of the 4 directions. The colony on the east was comprised mostly of tribal groups of indigenous beings who were already living on Earth when the Maldekians first arrived. These were the younger souls who had been birthed into lower dimensions to evolve from the bottom up. The eastern coast extended just about to the present Cascade Mountain Range, with most of what is now the United States and Canada submerged beneath the ocean. From part of Texas down through Mexico and most of Central America was another continent. This landmass extended considerably further west than it does today, however. The eastern Lemurians had come from that continent via small canoe-like boats that held about 12 people each. There were originally 4 boats containing 48 people that arrived on Lemurian shores. The new inhabitants on the south of Lemuria had come from the southern continent in the vicinity of what is now called the Hawaiian Islands. They had invented simple boats with sails in order to travel to the big land, which was occasionally vaguely visible from higher peaks of Hawaii on clear days. These people were members of the former Maldekian Free Orion colony, which had been born of Pleiadian parents. There were originally around 120 settlers from this group who landed in Lemuria. They were also the first to be introduced to the Mer people. On the west of Lemuria, the young indigenous souls came from Asia. They too traveled by water in simple crafts they had invented. However, their watercrafts were more like rafts than boats. One raft and its passengers had been toppled, and the people all killed on their first journey. When the rest arrived, there was only about 100 people. The north was settled by migrators from the present-day Alaskan Canadian continent who had crossed a marshy peninsula to explore the continent of Lemuria. These early Lemurians were also young indigenous souls whose urges toward exploration and discovery had awakened. There were around 200 of these people. The new colonists on the south of Lemuria began to meet the Mer people and interact with them, and as a result, their lives and consciousnesses were awakened quickly. By the time the sailboats were sent back to the Hawaiian continent and returned to Lemuria with another 120 people, those who had stayed behind to begin colonization were very altered. As the new families arrived, they were at first confused about the strange behavioral and attitudinal changes in their old friends. Those who had spiritually awakened initially acted mysteriously about what had brought about these changes, yet promised that the new arrivals would soon have their own first-hand experiences. For a few weeks, the latter explored nearby areas, established dwellings and storage buildings, created cooking areas, gathered necessary raw materials, and generally settled in. When the time came for the latest arrivals to meet the Mer people, they had already been impacted greatly through their exposures and interactions with the first Lemurians. Therefore, they were ready and had much the same experiences as the first humans upon meeting the Mer people. Joyful celebrations were held with feasting, music, and shared stories between the Mer people, the fairies, and the humans, and all were greatly enriched. Theirs was a happy and rapidly unfolding way of life, and for many years they lived in a carefree manner and with constantly renewed inspiration. The Mer people, like dolphins, are light beings from Sirius, who came to Earth not only to experience third-dimensional reality, but to create a bridge between the stars, dolphins, and humans. They carry the DNA of humans and dolphins combined, just as they do on Sirius, in order to create a spiritual magnetism towards spontaneous right action founded in unconditional love. In other words, all of their doing springs forth from their naturally sacred way of being. Action comes from their beingness, not from willful egos. They are selfless, unconditionally loving and giving, and dedicated to oneness of all things. and still their own lives are self-fulfilling, joyous, receptive, and overflowing. This may seem like a contradiction to those still stuck in ego. How can you be totally selfless and yet be receptive and self-fulfilled? It is the way of divinity and oneness, the only way. The divine human must learn this seemingly paradoxical way of being and doing in order to find peace and completion within. Why? Because your own spirits require that it be so. The divine human being is one who has transcended all belief of separation and a win-lose or lose-lose mentality. Those outworn ways of thinking and being are replaced with awareness of and dedication to the oneness of all things and all beings, and to a win-win way of interacting and co-creating with others. To do so, you must be willing to allow your heart to open fully, to relinquish all control and resistance, and to be like little children again. You must observe and participate in life as if all of life is sacred and cherishable because it is. You must relearn how to be enthusiastic and how to live in awe and wonder. You must let go of all of your shallow ways and be fully present with life, as if each and every day is a precious gift you are given to experience to its fullest. When you live in this way, you naturally begin to overflow. You become lovingly contagious, just as the Mare people were to these early earth dwellers. And from that place of self-fulfillment, this overflowing love and exuberance for life spills onto others around you. You give because you love. You love because you are grateful. And you are grateful because you love. It is really simple, but you must risk letting a little sophistication slip away. You must chance being looked at strangely and not always being understood, and you must lose control. That is what the Mare people, the dolphins, the fairies, in each in their own way, are here to teach. They are all still here to teach unconditional love. The Mare people came to Earth because of their deep desire to give to and interact with all other life forms, and because they were needed. The heart of what many of you fondly remember or sense as the Lemurian way is in truth the Syrian dolphin and Mare people way, and yet that too became jaded over time. About 50 years into the colonization of the Lemurian continent, approximately 136,000 years ago, the Pleiadian and Andromedan hierarchies had established a 4th through 6th dimensional city of light inside a 14,000-foot mountain at the exact center of that continent. This peak was very similar in shape to Mount Fuji in Japan, and was the first mystery school to be established on Earth since before the previous ice age. The top of the peak was glacier covered, which gave it a year-round snow-capped peak. These tall white peaks were key to holding higher dimensional frequencies due to the purity of the crystalline formation of the ice and snow. The Lemurian peak was called Wabasi, which means the soul's way home, or the way to the stars. Its appearance was always a source of awe and intriguing for the Lemurians of all colonies, and yet nobody could travel to it. Somehow, explorers would find themselves lost in the jungles that surrounded Mount Wabasi like a wide moat, or they would run into areas with so many snakes that they were afraid to attempt to move through. You see, Mount Wabasi was heavily protected by the planetary guardians until the correct time came for it to be accessed, and then only for sincere spiritual purposes by people holding that vibration. At the 50-year point, however, the Pleiadian and Andromedan teachers and guardians telepathically began to communicate, first with the mare people and then with selected individuals on the south, that it was time for a few initiates to come to the mountain. These messages were always confirmed for the people by the mare people in the beginning, but later a person's receipt of this telepathic invitation was taken for granted as legitimate. When people were called to the center of the island, it was always considered a great honor, and the individuals who were chosen were supported and revered by their constituents. Ma-Ra, the first Lemurian initiate. The first to be called by the guardians, as the Lemurians called them, was a 20-year-old woman who had been so-called baptized with the mare people and christened by the fairies within hours of her birth. When she was born, a star was visibly seen emanating from the center of her chest by those who had clear third-eye vision, and they knew she was blessed with special gifts. She was named Ma-Ra, which meant the goddess who is the mother of the sun. Therefore, when she was called, her people were greatly moved, and yet considered it natural that she should be the first chosen initiate. She was told to prepare by fasting only on seawater for 3 days and nights, and on the 4th morning to eat only what the fairies brought her. The fairies were told telepathically to collect flower petals from specific species and to bring them to Ma-Ra in fresh spring water in a stone bowl. Ma-Ra was told to first drink only the flower water and then to sit facing the rising sun in full lotus position with her arms raised, bent at the elbows and palms open facing the sun. This position is one of deep surrender of the ego will and fusion with the light of divine will, purpose, and truth. As she sat in this position for several hours, she was taken on a visionary journey during which she was shown her own past lifetimes and future lives. Ma-Ra saw herself as a priestess in the temples of Melchizedek back on the planet Maldek, being initiated in the ceremony of divine sovereignty. This was a spiritual rite of passage given to those who had attained a level of spiritual purity and wisdom that enabled them to be responsible and accountable for living as spiritual authorities unto themselves and others. It was also a recognition that the initiate was in direct contact with his or her higher self. Ma-Ra saw herself being dressed in a white robe for her initiation and led to and placed in a shallow, human-sized stone bath. The bath was spring-fed from below its rock-lined bottom and considered very sacred. As the water covered her body, she felt a sharp bolt of electrical light pierce her 3rd chakra. She had breathed deeply to release resistance to this piercing light, as her whole body began to shake violently and to become less and less solid, until all that remained was an etheric form made of billions of points of sparkling light. As she witnessed her complete surrender to this transfiguration in her past Maldekian life, she simultaneously re-experienced it in her 20-year-old Earth body. Her Ka was completely activated, connecting her higher self with her human form during this experience. All self-doubts and blocks on all levels were cleared like smoky vapors, rising from and leaving her body. When her body became physical again, she was more than she had been. Her inner knowing of limitlessness, life beyond form, Memories of her Maldekian enlightenment and her own soul's origins and purpose were completely restored to her conscious awareness. As the Maldekian past life initiation vision and re-experience were completed, Ma-Ra instantly became bigger than Mount Wabasi and found herself flying above the precession of her future lives. She saw pain and struggle, great love and compassion, deep wounding and separation, and eventually a life in which she would be re-initiated as a sovereign queen in Egypt around 10,000 BC. That lifetime would be the next one on Earth, during which she would experience total enlightenment and spiritual freedom. Next, she saw herself as an enlightened priestess of the mystery schools of Isis, which is called the temples of the Mara in Hebrew countries. She saw herself giving birth to a special child who is later named Yeshua ben Yusef and called Jesus Christ by the modern humans. She saw herself taking him to the river one moon cycle after his birth and giving him a baptismal initiation as a divine sovereign being. This was the meaning of baptism in its origin and truth, the releasing of the initiate from all illusions and past ties, and an honoring of the person's spiritual awakeness, alignment with their own higher self, and ability to serve and act as a spiritually sovereign being. Ma-Ra's love for and dedication to and honoring of this tiny human brought ancient future tears of remembrance to her eyes, and to our author Amora's eyes as she channeled this material and shared in the visions. Ma-Ra wept even more as she watched Yeshua mature and saw herself taking him to Egypt to be initiated and taught in the pyramids. She observed herself and her future 18-year-old son walking hand in hand on the backs of crocodiles, as if they were nothing more than stepping stones into the death chambers of a maze-like temple. They dropped hands and entered individual chambers, where they were immediately put into a deep sleep. For 3 days, while asleep in these chambers, they faced all of their worst fears and ego illusions. If either had succumbed to any of these experiences, she or he would immediately die. Both emerged 4 days later and were quietly and secretly taken to the Great Pyramid for a final initiation ceremony before returning to their homeland. The visions faded again, and Ma-Ra saw herself in the cities of light on Sirius, being prepared for her final service as an emissary of light on Earth. She saw even later visions of herself appearing in radiant light form to many people on Earth, and sometimes speaking to the people and sometimes simply opening their hearts. She saw the fall of the Catholic Church and Orthodox Christianity, and wept again as she witnessed the return of sacredness to Earth and true sovereignty to her people. She saw a mass awakening and the second coming of Christ consciousness en masse sweeping the planet, during which she and her Earth Son and a host of other radiant ones held out their hands to welcome many thousands of beings into the higher dimensional cities of light. Eventually, the visions faded, and she was simultaneously filled with and at one with a great, huge light that seemed to fill and connect her with all of existence. As she let go into this infinite sun, she was blended with the collective consciousness of all that is, and she knew total peace and surrender. After a few minutes of Earth time, she found herself walking down a golden aisle of light towards two golden light thrones. Sitting on them were the two most radiant beings she could ever imagine, one male and one female. As she approached them, she was filled with even more love and radiant light than before. The Holy Father and Holy Mother each extended a hand to her, and she knelt before them. Then the Holy Father spoke to her, saying, "Daughter of darkness, you have returned to the light from whence you were conceived. You may remain here with us if you choose to do so, for you have no need to return to earth for yourself. You are complete now. But if you do choose to do so, you may return to earth and step into the lives you saw flashing before you just now. If you choose this, you will first go to the sacred mountain and be trained in the ways of alchemy and transcendence of limitation. Then you will return to your people briefly and bring the sacred laws to them. This is only if you choose to go back. What would you have your own destiny to be, my child?" As Ma-Ra looked deeply into the eyes of the Holy Mother and Holy Father, tears of great love and completion flowed once more. Softly, she responded, "I cannot stay here with you while they remain on earth. My love for my own future on earth, all of it, and for earth's people and their lives, calls me to return and fulfill my purpose there." The Holy Mother replied, "My beautiful daughter, earth and her people will awaken with or without you. If it is your motherly pull and magnetism that pulls you to return, be honest about that." This last statement was intended to challenge Ma-Ra's sense of knowing versus her self-doubt about her motivations. She sat in silence and contemplatively retreated inside for a few moments as she felt the truth of her own words. Then she answered, "Holy Mother, I am that I am." As she released their hands, consciousness slowly returned to her body on earth, where she still sat in full lotus palms facing east. The sun now was at about 60 degrees angle in the sky, and the fairies all around her on the ground were deeply asleep. She saw the bowl of flower petals in front of her. She reached down and slowly ate each petal individually, thanking the fairies and the flowers for their gifts. As the fairies awoke, they were startled to see her. They excitedly told her about the great beam of light that had surrounded her and filled the area. She had become a body of light within the beam, at which time the fairies had fallen into a deep trance-like sleep and dreamed of their subterranean worlds they would inhabit in future times. Two of the fairies had been told in their dreams to accompany Ma-Ra to the base of Mount Wabasi, where they would find a cave. They were to leave Ma-Ra at that point and go into the cave deep beneath Earth's surface and be prepared to be the first king and queen of the fairies. Their roles would be spiritually somewhat like that of the Holy Mother and Holy Father, as well as teachers and guardians to the rest of the fairies. He was the being who later became known as Pan, and she was named Pandora. The three left for their journey the next morning, just after a sunrise ceremony with their human, fairy, and merpeople friends. A fire was lit on the beach to be tended and kept burning until a signal was received that all three chosen ones were safely at their destination at Mount Wabasi. It It was a 3-day journey before they arrived at the entrance to the cave where Pan and Pandora left Mara. Prior to entering the cave, they assisted Mara in building a large fire and sending smoke signals back to the people on the shore. Then the fairies and Mara departed. Mara intuitively found her way to an ancient-feeling grove where she prepared to spend her first night alone. As she fell into a deep sleep, her astral body separated from her physical body, and she discovered that her body was surrounded by about 30 beings dancing around a fire, playing flutes, singing, and laughing. Some of the beings were fairy-like, only larger. There were half-animal, half-human beings. Some were half-goat, others half-horse or unicorn, while still others appeared to be part bird, part human. She was intrigued by these unique and strange ones all around her, and as she rose from her sleeping body, she too was pulled into the dance. After a few minutes, the music and dancing ended abruptly as a metal trumpet was sounded. A dwarf-size male and female were carried into the grove on gold, fabric, and flower-decorated carriers, and all of the other beings turned to welcome and honor them with a Namaste. Mara instinctively did the same. As she lifted her head afterward to look at the two beings, she was summoned to come before them. The carriers were lowered to the ground, and the small male and female stepped out to greet her. She was startled when she recognized the faces of Pan and Pandora, and they all began to laugh heartily. Next, Mara was led to a golden throne in the center of the grove. It was empty except for a gold and silver cape and a jeweled crown in the seat. The throne was surrounded by flowers and flower petals, which were also being strewn along the path in front of her as she approached the throne. Two young females in white, flowing gowns, with garlands of flowers in their hair and around their necks, wrists, and ankles, picked up the cape and extended it to Mara. As she walked forward, the cape was draped around her shoulders, after which the two young women placed the crown on her head. This last act was met with peals of laughter, applause, music, and general excitement and celebration. Mara felt a little bit confused and yet at home and familiar with her new surroundings and people. As the celebration continued, Mara sat on the throne patiently, awaiting some message or offering from her hosts and followers. Instead, when she awakened on the ground inside the grove just before sunrise, all was quiet and seemingly undisturbed. She stood, slowly stretched, and released the stiffness from having slept on the ground. As she did so, a small bird landed on her hand and offered her a flower in its beak. She took the flower, inhaled its essence and sweet fragrance, then ate the petals one by one. Small animals began to come out from behind trees or emerged from holes in the ground, and even a large deer stepped into the clearing. They seemed to be there to get a look at her, and yet there was a feeling of expectancy from them as well. She greeted them with gentle laughter and delight, squatted and extended her hand as a welcome. A squirrel cautiously walked over to her, sniffed her fingers, and then scurried away. The others stood watching. Mara decided to try talking to the animals and asked them what they wanted from her. In reply, the deer turned and looked in the opposite direction toward the peak of Mount Wabasi. As Mara observed the deer, she felt as though she were being invited somewhere up the mountain. She asked the animals to lead her where she needed to go, and as she did so, the deer, the bird, and the squirrel began to turn and go toward the mountain. Mara followed. Occasionally, one of the creatures would turn and look at her, but otherwise it was a straightforward trek for nearly 2.5 hours. At that time, the animals stopped and sat down, looking at Mara to indicate that she should sit as well. Within minutes, several fairies brought bowls of flower water, fruit, wafer-like cookies, and honey. The animal guides and Mara ate the foods as the fairies told her how excited they were that she had finally come. They had been told for several years about her impending arrival and had prepared food and shelter for her. Another 1.5-hour walk brought Mara, the fairies, and her animal guides to a small cave whose opening had been extended into a room with a thatched roof and grass and twig walls. A sleeping pad had been created of straw covered in tightly woven linen. A fire pit had been built inside the cave with a hole in the thatched roof to let out the smoke. The fairies told Mara she would be staying with them for a while and learning about plants, animals, minerals, and their relationship with fairies and humans. She was being initiated into the world of fairies and nature. Mara spent 4 months in that current mountain home, with fairies and animals as her guides and teachers every day. She was taken on trips to different areas of the mountain and taught the ways of herbs and flowers. She learned to recognize the creation signatures of all plants and understood their uses in healing, nutrition, and spiritual awareness. She learned how to make flower essences and herbal remedies, and how to call on animal spirits for guidance and teaching. By night, she almost always found herself in the grove with the same host of humans and other creatures as on her first night there. At times, fairies or humans came to her there to ask her to settle disputes or to give them advice. Even humans from her home on the south of Lemuria would show up in the grove in their astral bodies. Mara would give advice, teach, recommend herbs and flowers, and sometimes take them on spiritual journeys to the stars or inside the mountain. Upon awakening, she was always surprised by her dreams and by the fact that she had so much more knowledge and ability while sleeping. She consistently seemed to know exactly what those who came to her needed, and she gave it freely. One morning as she awoke, she heard voices outside her hut. As she came into the clearing outside, a very tall man stood with several of the fairies. The fairies were pleading with him that Mara should be left with them a little longer. They had grown very fond of her and wanted a little more time with her before she was taken away. The man spoke very authoritatively, telling the fairies that she had completed what she had come to them for and must continue her initiations inside the mountain now. As Mara approached, the man turned toward her and greeted her with a Namaste. He then identified himself by saying, "Hello, Mara, Queen of Heaven and Earth. Your next journey of remembering awaits you. My name is Hara, and I live in the City of Light at the center of the mountain. I am your own male counterpart. I have never been physically embodied as you have, even though I appear to you to be physical now. I am, as you are, an emissary of light from the ancestor stars, the Pleiades. Soon you and I will be together again, but first you must complete your initiations in the City of Light. There you will learn to transcend the seemingly limited physical world, reunite with your galactic consciousness, and remember what you are here to teach the people." We are forerunners of what humans are becoming, regardless of their celestial origins. Many of the humans on Earth, as well as Earth herself, have been imprisoned in the past by dark beings who would control instead of empower others. Even whole planets have succumbed to these controlling ones, and yet they too must eventually return to the light. For light is truth, and truth is light. All of existence will know this soon. The people of Earth must learn to trust themselves and the goddess God Prime Creatorix again. They are afraid to become mature, responsible, and sovereign beings, and believe themselves to be only the products of creation and not the creators. They will learn to be co-creators with the goddess God as they remember the divinity of their own souls and spirits. We must prepare for that time now, as well as for the times in between. You are a radiantly beautiful goddess whose role on earth is to nurture your children, all children, back into their own remembrance of their divine truth. And I am your male link to other worlds left behind, that we might bridge the many worlds as one. Let us go now. As Hara became silent, the two looked into one another's eyes for what seemed like an eternity in an instant. Their light bodies magnetically reached out to each other, and they became transfixed as a single point of light and consciousness. Mara was able to see his visions and experience his thoughts as her own. Hara felt her feelings and deep surrender and compassion. For those moments, only one flame burned brightly, as their two flames united, completely blended and whole again. As Mara let go completely, she lost all sense of time, space, thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and yielded to the oneness with all that is. When she returned to individual consciousness a few moments later, she opened her eyes to find herself inside the crystalline city of light, inside Mount Wabasi. Through her complete surrender, she had teleported to the inside of the mountain, within Hara's consciousness, and then rematerialized as Mara. This was her first lesson, and from that point on, when she wanted to go from one place to another, all she had to do was teleport herself there. She remained inside the City of Light for many months. She learned and remembered very quickly in these sacred surroundings. Her teachers were Syrian, Pleiadian, and Andromedan light beings who quickened her frequencies with higher dimensional energies and encodings. It was more a return to who she truly was than it was a process of learning and changing. And yet it all had to be done with third-dimensional methods in order to ground it into her life on Earth. She became one with and read the crystal records of Earth. She astral traveled to Sirius, Alcyone, and Orion to be initiated and re-educated as to the role of each star system in the unfolding divine plan for Earth and your solar ring. She astral projected in order to swim with whales, dolphins, and the mer people, and rediscover their roles as time and record keepers, teachers and holders of Christ consciousness, and guardians of life, respectively. She journeyed in the bodies of animals, and in her Pleiadian and galactic light bodies, and blended her physical instincts with her multidimensional consciousness, creating a grounding for her higher self on Earth. She fully reunited with Hara as her mantle of light was activated, giving her access to all her memories as needed to fulfill her service to the divine plan. When her trainings were completed, Ma-Ra teleported herself back to her home village on the Lemurian shores. Though she had been gone for over a year by Mount Wabasi time, she soon discovered that her people perceived her to have been absent from them for only one moon cycle. Yet, in order to share the appropriate small portion of her experiences with her people, many months were required of storytelling. It was not Ma-Ra's role to teach them how to teleport or any of the other initiatic trainings. She was only to share her learnings from her 4 months with the fairies studying plants, minerals, and animals, with those who showed natural interest and aptitude. Other than that, she could share with the people the general nature of the teachings from the City of Light, but not the details. Those who were called would learn as she had learned. Otherwise, it was simply inappropriate to try and teach those who were not yet ready. For the next few years, Ma-Ra traveled back and forth between Mount Wabasi and the shore. She often accompanied new initiates to the mountain and through their first initiation of teleportation to the inside of the mountain. Pan and Pandora held similar roles within the fairy kingdom, and yet the teachings were quite different. The fairies were taught about their galactic origins and relationship and service to the goddess specifically. They were the most cherished children of the goddess, because their creation was specific to third and fourth dimensional joy of creation itself. The fairies were literally created to delight in creation and to feel their emotions deeply. The goddess loved and cherished the fairies and impulsed them with celestial music and light they could hear and see all the time. The fairies personified this music, love, and delight, and impulsed the goddess through the feelings that accompanied their experiences. Their role was, and is, to embody and protect the essence of what you know of as the magical child self. Without the existence of fairies, the magical child consciousness of humanity would be all but lost. The fairies help keep human innocence, playfulness, joy, wonder, sexual spontaneity, and humor alive. Pan, Pandora, and Ma-Ra brought these teachings about the interrelatedness of all living things back to their respective people. The fairies were to help keep the magical child selves alive in the humans, and the humans were to love and protect the fairies and cherish them as the goddess does. This is still intended to be their appropriate roles, although it has not been honored by most humans for a very long time. During Ma-Ra's lifetime on Lemuria, around 50 people were called to Mount Wabasi and initiated. The Lemurian mystery schools and spiritual culture were begun and continued to expand beyond that time. When she was 80 years old, Ma-Ra completed her purpose on Lemuria and ascended. She became the first ascended master on Earth, setting a precedent for many millennia to come. Following her ascension, the people of Lemuria gradually became more widespread as their population increased. The people from the 4 directions of the continent began to meet one another about 20 years following Ma-Ra's ascension, or about 130 years into inhabitants of the Lemurian continent. These meetings were peaceful and exciting for the people from all groups. The younger-souled beings from the west, north, and east had by that time met and associated with both fairies and mer people, and were quite open-hearted and pure in their intent. Therefore, their meeting with the more evolved humans was a natural next step in their own evolution. Further development of Lemurian culture. For around 500 years, these early Lemurians wove together a culture whose spiritual foundation was in the interrelatedness with the fairies, mer people, and nature. Those who were called to Mount Wabasi were only about 2% of the overall population of the continent. The Lemurians supported and celebrated those who were called, but the continent's population as a whole was not directly involved in the mystery school initiatic training. The majority of the Lemurians were learning about love, sexual freedom, balance with nature, and unity in diversity among species, as well as among the humans of different origins. All of the Lemurians were primarily light-hearted and filled with childlike innocence, purity, and curiosity. A shared language was gradually created that enabled these diverse groups to communicate with one another. Methods of tool making, architecture, boat building, food preparation, weaving, singing, and instrument making were shared among the groups. The people as a whole seemed almost obsessed with finding new and better ways of performing everyday activities. Stone masonry was one of the Lemurians' early discoveries that had the greatest impact on their society. Beginning with simple rock and mortar structures, they quickly branched out to include artistic touches such as stone and wood carving, pottery and clay sculpture, and drawings in stone. All of these were begun within the first 630 years of human colonization of Lemuria. The first Incans. During the following 500 years, many more people from varying locations found their way to Lemuria. One group of 120 male explorers arrived on the southeast coast of Lemuria near the end of this 500-year period. They were the newest Earth inhabitants at that time. 4,000 Pleiadians from a planet in the Mayan star system had come to Earth to give birth to a group of 10,000 souls from a planet called Raman in the Orion system. Though these Pleiadian Maya were more spiritually evolved than the Ramanians, they too were still moving toward their own enlightenment and spiritual mastery. Most of the Pleiades was in a transition to becoming a galactic mystery school. Those who were not quite at that stage of growth yet were being sent to Earth for their further evolution. The Pleiadians who established the first Incan colonies were those who gave birth to the Ramanians. Their fourth-dimensional light bodies were simply downstepped over a few weeks' time until they were fully in their third-dimensional bodies. They were in a deep sleep state for the last few days of this shift into Earth bodies, after which they awakened in their new homes. The Ramanians' home planet in the Orion system had been imprisoned, and its people enslaved for nearly 100,000 years, when a nuclear explosion caused the entire planet to spontaneously combust. It had been left lifeless and devoid of surface water. The Ramanian souls, whose bodies were killed in the fires, had been cocooned by the galactic and Pleiadian emissaries of light and brought to the oceans and dolphins on Earth about 1,300 years prior to the arrival of humans on Lemuria. About 500 years into the Lemurian colonization, these Ramanians began to be born in the areas that are now called Central America and Northern South America. Their home planet had been very technologically advanced. After they experienced 2 or 3 early lifetimes on Earth as Pleiadian offspring, they strengthened quickly and began to focus on inventions that would take them beyond being survivalists. The Pleiadians had developed a more sophisticated culture for the Ramanians to come into than had previously been established on Earth. Adobe and stone buildings already existed when the Ramanians were born. Cultivation practices using primitive plows had begun. Musical instruments, somewhat like the flute, the lyre, the drum, and guitar of today's world, were already part of this early Incan lifestyle. Even simple jewelry making and gem polishing were a part of their way of life. After about 3 generations, the new Earth dwellers invented wheeled carts and began domesticating wild donkeys to pull them. Weapons were also a part of their early inventive focus, important to their psyches for protection, as well as a means of killing animals for food. Bows and arrows, slings, and spears were naturally the first to be created. But more brutal weapons, such as spiked mallets, soon followed. Their Pleiadian Incan parents created a loving and safe environment for the Ramanian refugees, yet the children were deeply ingrained with distrust and defensive behavioral patterns. It was not uncommon for children to attack and accuse one another of misdeeds. At times, they would even become hysterical and begin hitting their parents and screaming. Though their parents were by nature a loving and peaceful people, they were not yet master beings themselves, and some of the parents lost their tempers and found themselves angrily spanking and punishing these difficult children. Of course, this increased distrust. And yet the Ramanians understood control through punishment. They even had a victim's type of respect for those using force. Therefore, the parents who used rash means to control their children did get more results than the more compassionate parents. Their social structure quickly became patriarchal, even though it did not begin that way. The Ramanian men had a strong drive for control and power. The women had been considered fair game by their oppressors on Raman. Even the married men had vented their frustrations on the women and children. Therefore, women and children had been, and quickly became again, the lower class citizens. The Pleiadians were not a patriarchal people, so this created some conflicts within the Incan colonies. About 3 generations into life on Earth, these colonies began to be divided into those that were primarily souls of Ramanian origins and those of Pleiadian origins. Though the colonies were always somewhat mixed and all had shared genetics, the souls of those of like-mindedness tended to be drawn toward one another as they died and were reincarnated. One such group of mostly Ramanian Incan men, while on a hunting expedition, came upon a tribe of about 100 people. These tribespeople were part of the young soul group birthed on Earth. These Incans immediately knew that they had nothing to fear from these innocent and still quite primitive people. Therefore they befriended them, thinking that good relations might prove beneficial later on. As they learned to communicate with one another over time, the tribe's people told the newcomers about a, quote, big land to the northwest and across a strip of ocean only a few miles wide. Stories were told about creatures that were half human and half fish, and little people called fairies. The mysterious Mount Wabasi was also mentioned in the intriguing tales. The Incan interest was sparked. The men were so magnetized to explore this land that they quickly set about improving on the simple boats of the tribespeople. They made larger boats, adding sails and oars that were held in place easily. Around 1,000 years into life on Lemuria, 120 Romanian men embarked upon their first journey to its shores. Because there were villages spread out around the coastline no more than 5 miles apart, the Incans quickly met their first Lemurian people. Fairies and Mer people had been warned about these newcomers in advance, and therefore warned the Lemurians that these people were different. The Lemurians were told that these men had come from a very difficult past circumstance, and tended to be rough and controlling as a result. Extension of hospitality with clear boundaries for the women was the best approach. Meanwhile, on their way to Lemuria, extremely high winds had arisen, and the men had worked very hard to keep control of their boats in the choppy waters. While attempting to lower the sails, 2 men had fallen overboard. They were both rescued by mermaids and brought back to their boats, heaving and gasping for breath. Though the mermaids disappeared quickly afterward, the men had been astonished by the appearance of such creatures, especially ones who were so obviously female. There were mermen in the sea as well, but it had been planned that the mermaids would meet the men first in order to humble them somewhat. So when they arrived on shore, the men were still shaken by the storm that had come and gone so quickly, and by their brief glimpses of the female rescuers who had saved 2 of them. With a combination of hand gestures and drawing in the sand, the men managed to communicate enough to find out that the Mer people were well known to the Lemurians and much loved and respected. The Romanians were awed by this fact, and it made them less guarded and controlling. Thus, the relations between the 2 groups began harmoniously and with minimal conflict. Although, about 2 days into their visit, some of the men began to make lewd advances towards a few of the women. Their husbands, fathers, and other males in the group simply and non-threateningly stepped between the visitors and the women, gesturing that the women were off limits. The Incans took these gestures to mean that the women were the property of the men who intervened, and they backed off from their advances. The Incans were amazed by the happiness and lightheartedness of their hosts. At first, they mistook the Lemurians to be simple-minded, but soon realized that they were quite intelligent and somehow familiar. Of course, Lemurians of the south were still primarily of free Orion and Earth Pleiadian origins. They had somewhat common backgrounds with the Romanian Incans, though much further removed from those old ties. They knew these newcomers were still too unpredictable to make themselves vulnerable. When the men returned to the shore before going back to their own homes across the water, they told their new friends that they would return soon. After receiving gifts of flower leis, fruits, and delicate foods for their trip home, they departed. The Incan men were definitely altered by their new acquaintances, though they would have been hard-pressed to explain it in words. When the Incan men arrived back at their city, they were already anxious to return to Lemuria. They told stories and tried to share their experiences with the people at home. Yet speaking in terms of feelings was not common to their people, and there was no really other way to adequately describe what had happened to them. Within 2 weeks, another expedition began, this time with 200 men. The second trip was very similar to the first, except there was no accident at sea. The Mer people did send 3 mermen and 2 mermaids to swim about 100 yards from the boats to make themselves seen by the men. The first reaction of the Incan men was to want to have sex with the mermaids, but they were not swimmers, so that was impossible. It did serve as a source of jokes and suppositions, however. Once on shore, the men were met by the Lemurian acquaintances of the first Incan men, who again presented them with leis of flowers, fruit, and honey water, and an array of foods. They visited and ate, and as the new men watched them, astonished by the openness, generosity, and trust, and apparent naivete of the people. While the men wanted to know if the Lemurians had ever had sex with mermaids, the Lemurians were so astonished by the question that they could scarcely answer. Mer people were sacred. They were from the stars, like the dolphins. The people learned from them and honored and revered them so highly they could not even imagine such a thing. As the visitors watched the reactions of the Lemurian men to their questions, the new men thought these Lemurians to be somehow less masculine than themselves. In the backs of their minds, the Incans registered the Lemurians as easy marks if they ever needed them for any reason. However, in the meantime, they simply enjoyed the hospitality, explored the land and its resources, shared stories as best they could, and became very comfortable with these strangely joyful people. Some of the Incan men were becoming much more relaxed. They were even learning manners and how to be considerate of others, although at times it still surprised them that they attempted to shift back to their old macho attitudes. The Lemurians felt deeply compassionate towards these men who were, to their way of thinking, so obviously unhappy and insecure. They attempted to be even kinder and more gracious and understanding with their guests than they normally would have been. And it worked.